Hello, listeners! We are absolutely chuffed you've decided to join us. Grab a packet of biscuits, brew a warm cuppa, and curl up for a wholesome American conversation about quintessential British food from everyone's favourite baking competition. Please enjoy Hats Off to Bake Off, an amateur baking podcast.
Hello and welcome to Hats Off to Bake Off, an amateur baking podcast. My name is Nick and I'm here with my friend Malory, and we are here together to talk about our favorite bits of the signature, technical, and showstopper from episode 6 of Collection 1, or Series 5, of the Great British Bake Off, or as we know it here in America, the Great British Baking Show. More advanced episode coming up today, and so Malory's going to talk us through different leavening agents as well as bakes that Malory and I did in our own kitchens and what we thought of the show. So let's get started. This was Continental Cakes Week, which was like a weird topic to even like try to get my head around, but
yeah, I had the same impression. I was thinking about it afterwards and I was like, I feel like they could have just called this Advanced Cake Week. I don't really have a lot of context for what makes a Euro cake, except for that it's from Europe. But I don't know if there's any sort of like general baking traditions that draw them together, or if they just needed an excuse to try out more weird bakes on the bakers, is really my theory there.
I mean, for them, it's Series 5, so they've had to go through a lot of the basics, and they are branching out near the end, especially if it's like Series like 6, 7, 8, like they get into some weird topics. But it's just the idea that like the show is about British baking, but also in Britain, you're so close to every other European country. You can hop on a train or a plane and be there in an hour, and somewhere they're talking a completely different language, whereas in America, that's almost an impossibility. So that's just a completely different world, is that they are so close to all these other cultures and continents or in countries. I think it's them being like, okay, you can bake like a Brit. Can you bake and be a little more worldly?
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't really think about it that way. But I thought it introduced me to some bakes that I would have never really heard of if not for this episode. And I don't think I had heard of really any of the bakes in the episode. Usually I have some sort of knowledge basis to go off of that I had built up before the show, but yeast leaven cakes, Princess Torte, Dobos Torte, nothing. This episode was what introduced those bakes to me for the first time.
I think I only know of the Dobos Torte because when I was a little kid, I would get cookbooks from the public library. And one of the cakes that I saw in that like old 1980s like black and white cookbook was a Dobos Torte. And it was like one of those ones where like all the recipes were black and white and then they had a few color photos.
Fancy color pictures, yeah.
Exactly. And so like one of the color pictures was this beautiful but super retro Dobos Torte, but with the classic caramel triangles. And I was like, what is this? I must make this.
And now you finally have.
I remember being like, I need to make this, and now I have.
You've realized Tiny Nick's dream.
That's basically why I had to do it this episode. I did the Dobos Torte, and I was so excited to do it because I was like, this is finally coming true. But yeah, that signature is a woozy. I've never heard of a yeasted cake.
It's really not as hard as I was expecting it to be. Watching all the bakers do it and seeing all the different ways they tackled it. We had a Kugelhopf, a few Savarins.
All words I've never heard of before.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of either of those. I had heard of a babka, which Kate did, and that's more of an Israeli bread cake.
It's in Eurovision, right?
Yes, I love that quote. That was like the best part. She's like, that counts.
Actually, I kind of have heard of a yeasted cake. I just didn't realize I had. So
which kind?
So this is something that I've seen and never eaten, but is technically yeasted cake. I just didn't realize it and didn't put it together until we started doing this episode. Do you know what a panettone is?
Oh, you were telling me about that. I had actually never heard of one, but you were educating on me earlier. So
a panettone, they mention it in one of the later episodes where he is cooling a cake upside down in a tin with like a string and stuff, like this whole rigmarole. He's making it in the panettone tin, but he's actually making a panettone. But it is a yeasted cake that's like a brioche bread, but usually it's filled with all kinds of dried fruits or chocolate or anything.
And Italian in origin, right?
Very Italian. I think specifically either Verona or Naples. So I got one, actually.
You bought one? It looks like a decorative box. It's just in a decorative box.
There we
LOL.
go.
I was like, yes, it. Aw.
So it actually does. It comes in this beautiful yellow box with like a little like string attached to it, like it's a little gift. Kind of like if you buy a fruitcake. Kind of that idea where it's already like pre-packaged.
Wow.
So in Britain, I think they'd have them like in tins. I've seen these whenever I go to an Italian bakery, all kinds of nougats and all kinds of panettone, and then, the Italian goods you can get anywhere else.
I would have never recognized it, I don't think, if I had seen it.
I don't know how I stumbled upon it, but I was like, wait a second, that is a yeast cake, isn't it? And right there in the ingredients is yeast. So
That's awesome. And when I was looking up my leaveners, it turns out that panettone was originally made with sourdough starter.
Yes.
And not baker's yeast. So that was a fun fact I learned about that yeasted cake.
Okay.
I loved the idea, of course, to no one's surprise, of Chetna's orange savarin that she did, and then Nancy's rum punch savarin. And then I thought Martha's chocolate savarin was a really clever idea too. I think she was the only one who really mixed chocolate into the batter itself. So it was interesting to see how it affected her rise, and it ended up turning out pretty well, I thought.
That chocolate dough looked so pretty. It was just really nice. I was also a really big fan of the cake that Louis made, the cinnamon apple one, just because he's all about precision. And so each of those little notches had a nut inside of it, and the apples were displayed in the most beautiful way possible. I don't think I could ever get apples to look like that if I tried over and over and over again.
I think his was definitely the prettiest this round. And his definitely inspired me, so I ended up doing and baking a Kugelhopf for the first time ever.
Kugelhopf.
Kugelhopf. For those of you who are unfamiliar, which I'm assuming is nearly everybody.
99 to 100% of you, probably.
Yeah, unless you are Austrian. It's an Austrian tea cake, basically, yeast leavened, of course, and traditionally flavored with some citrus, and then filled with raisins and topped with slivered almonds, and then covered in either a syrup, or a few of the recipes I found had it just like covered in icing sugar. So I took that idea and sort of flipped it a little bit, and did a rosewater almond Kugelhopf. So instead of using like a bright orange blossom syrup or orange juice, I soaked the sultanas. So this is the first time on this podcast I ended up baking something twice, because I did it the first time around and I was really happy with it, but I didn't feel like my flavors were present enough, because I was using, like I always do, a few different recipes, but then adding in my own flavors. And it just didn't feel like it had enough of what I wanted. It was a little bit too plain. So I actually ended up baking it again. And I got my flavors where I want it. So this time, if you use my recipe, this is a recipe that's been adapted and has landed where I want it. And so instead of soaking, traditionally in a Kugelhopf, you soak the raisins in a brandy. And so I soaked mine instead in rosewater and amaretto to give it a little bit more of that sort of almond-y flavor. And then, just covered the whole thing in almonds. It's really simple to bake. The only thing that's kind of a pain is you have to let it rise twice for at least an hour each.
So it's kind of a whole day thing.
Yeah, like a whole afternoon thing. But once it's in the oven, it still bakes in about 35 to 40 minutes. And you can bake it in a traditional bundt pan if you don't have a Kugelhopf tin.
Which, of course, you went out and bought a Kugelhopf tin.
Yeah, I don't have a bundt pan, so I figured now all my bundt cakes will look significantly cooler.
It is a very cool looking pan.
Yeah, exactly. It's like significantly taller. So would you have done a panettone then if you had to do a yeast leavened cake in the tent?
I have no idea. I actually haven't tried my panettone yet. I was going to try some right now so I can see what it tastes like. I did look up I looked up other versions, and obviously, as they probably mentioned in the show, yeast leavened cakes have been around for ages because we haven't always had baking powder. So
right.
When cakes were first becoming a thing, yeast is what you did, and so cakes were just sweet breads, but not sweetbreads, 'cause that's a whole other thing, of course. God damn it, English, why you like this? But they were sweet flavored breads. Mm-hmm. And so I found some really fascinating ones. I found oh Lord, I thought Kugelhopf and Kugelhopf was bad. Bienenstich.
Oh, is that another German one?
I have no idea. Probably. It looks like
it sounds German.
It's a bee sting cake. So
cool.
I kind of forget why. I think it was because it was stripy, but it was like a yeast leaven cake that was cut. And so it was like a layered cake. And then they have the top
so
all
layered.
fancy looking. And then this was actually an American one I found. So in America, evidently, I've never heard of this before, we have a sourdough, like a spicy election cake. These were meant to be absolutely massive to like feed the entire town as they came out for elections. And so it was this big celebration cake that was like really beautifully spicy.
You mean to tell me that at some point in this country we actually incentivized voting?
I mean, it may have
Not
also...
to be salty, but that sounds unreal to me.
I mean, I think it was like a celebration for, I think, the Civil War. And then like when that was over, they're like, let's just do it for elections. So it also may have been a bit of a bribe. So maybe don't get super excited. But people had cake on election day, which was pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, panettone is from Milan, or there's another variation of it called Pandoro from Verona, which were both these very luxurious bread cake things. Or I found in Russian Easter, which looks like a panettone but covered in frosting, was a pascha or a bulik. So for Russian Easter celebrations, they had those. So like everywhere from colonial America to Russia, they have these yeasted cakes. So for something I've never heard of, they're everywhere.
Yeah. And I think it just really goes to show how much baking has changed since the invention of chemical leaveners. And that really got me thinking, this whole episode, I wanted to dive a little bit more into what makes cakes rise, especially because every bake this episode uses a different leavening agent. The yeast leaven cakes obviously are leavened with yeast, and then the Princess Torte, Mary's recipe, adds baking powder as a chemical leavener. And then for the Dobos Torte, the sponge that most of the bakers used is just whipped. It's sort of air leavening. So it just made me want to look more into this and really just lay a good foundation for what are the different techniques for getting a good rise in a bake, and to talk about when different ones are used and sort of what's the difference between them. But before I get into that, Nick, how many leaveners can you name? I'm just curious.
Ooh. Okay. So like a leavener in the traditional sense would be sometimes a base and an acid. So I think that's baking powder. Or you have like baking soda, which is just the acid. No, it's just the base, and then you add an acid like buttermilk. So we count that as 2. Then you said egg whites would be 3. Yeast would be 4. I'm sure there's other variations. So sourdough starter, I guess, is a sort of...
It's similar.
4.5.
We'll get into that for sure.
Is there more?
Yeah, because I feel like when we think of a leavener, we're thinking of something that we're going to put in there to do the heavy lifting and actually create the rise itself. But honestly, I feel like the things that tend to be forgotten are the mechanical leaveners. So like whipping air into a meringue or whipping air into a sponge cake. But then also one that I didn't think about until I was looking into this was steam. So if you think about what makes a choux rise, a puff pastry rise, a popover rise, it's all about creating a really sort of gelatinous batter that will then sort of be moist enough that will then like sort of poof up and rise when the steam gets created and trapped by the batter. Or in the case of puff pastry, you're creating those layers, right, with the fat in between.
The butter, yeah.
Right, which will then create steam and create flakes.
Okay, so it's just like, it's not even a... Well, I guess it is a leavening agent because it is just a way to make something rise. That's...
Right. So really, the way to think about leavening in baking isn't only to think about what's making what's creating the gas, because that's really all leavener is gas in some form or another. It's also how you decide to trap it.
Okay.
So what you're using to create the gas and how you're capturing it to hold that puff or that rise.
Huh. So all the other ingredients are adding liquids or adding moisture to help it rise. You have some that are making kind of a glutinous or a gelatiny mass so that it sticks together when it rises, and then the sugars and stuff that'll caramelize and harden it into that shape.
Yeah.
Oh my God, this is so cool.
I know.
Keep going.
Okay. I know. This is why I was like, I feel like there's more to discover about this. Then we get into the chemical leaveners, which is what we as sort of modern day bakers traditionally reach for whenever we're throwing a cake in the oven. It's baking soda, which is exactly as you described. Baking soda is an alkaline substance that reacts with acid to form carbon dioxide gas. So think back to your elementary school science project Volcano, the classic baking soda and vinegar combo. That's exactly what's happening in our bakes. It's usually why you mix in the baking powder with the dry ingredients, and whatever your acid is, whether it's buttermilk or honey or natural cocoa powder or whatever it may be, usually gets mixed in with the wet ingredients, and then the two are combined, thrown into the heat of the oven, and left to rise. Baking powder is a little bit different in that it's basically, and again, as you mentioned, a base and an acid already combined, usually with some sort of medium like cornstarch. So all you need to activate baking powder is just a little bit of water and heat.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. It should be said, though, baking soda is about 3 to 4 times stronger than baking powder. So you need a lot less to create the same amount of rise. But, and this is something, have you ever had, like, maybe your friend wasn't that great of a baker, just found some sort of shady recipe online and didn't double check it, and has made you either like cookies or cakes that had like a really kind of like gross, bitter aftertaste to them? Have you ever had that? Or like maybe a pancake?
I don't think so, but I think I know what you're going
Yes.
towards.
Yes. So I've definitely been a victim to some of these just like bad bakes. And the problem was that the person added in too much baking soda or did not have any sort of acidic ingredient in there to balance it out. So when you think about it, if you're combining the right proportions of a base and an acid, they'll neutralize. And you won't have any of that bitter, basey taste left. But if you don't, you're sort of left tasting some almost like Arm & Hammer toothpaste yick.
Almost
that
like
just like
metallic
hasn't
taste, right?
Right. The chemical reaction hasn't taken place enough for that to completely go away.
And a lot of recipes will try to use that. They'll try to use a bunch of baking powder just to get any amount of rise, which isn't what you want most of the time, right?
Yeah, it's not always ideal to have it, but you can basically have one or the other. Like you'll see a couple of recipes use a little bit of both. And I think part of that's because if the recipe itself doesn't have enough acid in it alone to use just baking soda, you'll use a little bit of baking soda, a little bit of baking powder. But you don't need that much as long as you're, again, combining the power of the leavener with the power of your dough to trap that air properly. I think the ratio that I've seen online is that for every cup of flour, you need about 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda. And that's assuming you have some sort of acidic medium in there to balance it out. And then for every cup of flour, you could use about a teaspoon of baking powder. So those are the traditional chemical leaveners. And then what we saw here in our first bake and what we'll continue to see throughout various bakes and also, of course, throughout the various bread weeks to come is the biological leaveners. And this is pretty much yeast. And then a cousin of yeast, which is sourdough starter, which is really a combination sort of yeast and bacteria.
So that's usually a natural yeast that you found in the air kind of idea, right?
Yes. So yeast is super cool. I'm actually going to talk about it for a lot right now. I just really wanted to get the other leaveners out of the way because yeast is amazing. It's so interesting.
Let's do it.
Yeast is a very diverse group of single-celled microorganisms that are actually classified as a fungus.
A fungus?
Yeah.
Excuse you?
Yeah. And here you thought you hated mushrooms.
But I love bread. Bread is amazing.
I know, right? So yeast is, like I said, super diverse. I won't get into the complications of its evolutionary tree, but the most common species that we use is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. I think I got that. It's also known as baker's yeast, which is a lot easier to say.
Your Latin was a lot better than my German, so you're good.
Thank you. I did listen to a pronunciation video beforehand.
Cheater.
I know. But it's the same species that's also commonly used to ferment alcohol. So baker's yeast, brewer's yeast, both names for what's usually the same species of yeast. Occasionally, that's not always the case, but these yeasts are present. This fungus, I guess, is present pretty much everywhere. It's often the thing that will start decomposing or eating your food when your food starts to spoil. It's just sort of like in the air.
Seriously? So like
Yep.
when your food gets all awful and disgusting in the fridge, it's probably just because there's yeast in the air?
Not always, but occasionally.
Some
and here's what's
variety of yeast and other random bacteria.
right. So yeast likes to eat sugars. So if it's like your jams or your bread. So if your bread gets moldy, it's likely a very similar yeast to what you used to ferment it in the first place. Isn't that kind of cool?
That's wild.
Yeah.
So just the airborne yeast is just eating its dead brethren.
Oh, yeah, I guess that's horrifying to think about.
It's revenge for killing its friends.
Oh God, it's just stealing it back. Yeah. I mean, that's actually a great way to think about it.
I'm so sorry. I should never have said that.
No, it's an accurate metaphor. So here's to science.
To science.
To science.
Yeast
So
cannibalism.
The reason that yeast is so useful to us is because it eats the sugars that are present in carbohydrates and converts them into carbon dioxide gas. And there you have it. We've actually been using it. Nick, can you guess how long and when and where this might have started?
Oh, Lord. What did I say in the last couple episodes? Bread was a thing, but then sourdoughs. At least 2,000 years?
It's ancient Egypt, pretty much, like everything else we think.
Okay.
So
okay.
ancient Egypt, I'm learning, is like literal breadbasket. Womb of baking was ancient Egypt. And there wasn't really any commercial source of yeast until the mid 1800s. So this is something I want to get very clear. When we think about like yeast and the sort of domesticated yeast that we're using in our bakes, that's not what was used for most of human history. And even baker's yeast and brewer's yeast wasn't used in baking for very long either. For most of human history, we were baking with sourdough.
So that goes back to the ancient Egyptians then, or?
Yeah. So sourdough starter is basically, like I said, a combination of baker's yeast and then also this type of bacteria, lactobacillus, which is also, I think, common in yogurts. It's a pretty common bacteria as well that's often just present in the air, which is why you can just make a sourdough starter using nothing but a combination of equal parts flour and water and just leave that sitting out, and a sour starter will be born. Pretty much since ancient Egypt, the theory is that they just left some batter or dough out that was going to be turned into like their cracker, ancient pre-bread, whatever.
Check out our bread episode for more information.
Exactly.
Sorry, our biscuit episode.
Our biscuit episode. So it was going to be like prepared into some sort of biscuit and then was left for too long, started to ferment, and actually they found that it rose and it also tasted better because those yeast and bacteria were digesting things and leaving residues basically that were tasty. So there wasn't any commercial source of yeast until the mid-1800s. Before then, people were using sourdough, like I mentioned, and occasionally borrowing some brewer's yeast from their local brewer. And actually, there are some really old recipes around that people would take the foam off of beer, or there's some like really old archaeological evidence that suggests that they were using beer foam as a way to make bread rise without having to do the long process of sourdough fermenting.
That's so wild.
Right. Yeah, because the yeast exists in the beer.
Okay.
And you're just giving them a new home.
Okay.
Like you would your
And so
active dry yeast.
Enough yeast was in the foam to put it into the bread?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the ratios are. I kind of wish I knew because I think that would be super dope. But yeah, in theory, that's pretty much how it worked.
Okay.
Yeah. And so in the mid-1800s, everybody's favorite microbiologist, Louis Pasteur, identified the microorganisms responsible for the fermentation that had been making our bread and our beer tasty for thousands of years.
Oh, okay. Cool.
So he was the guy to basically say, hey, this thing that's happening, it's because of this particular microbe and a family of others. And then it was sort of easier from that point on to isolate it and get it to a point where it could be sold. So then fast forward about 100 years, and the active dry yeast that you know and love was invented in World War II as a way to increase fresh yeast. Oh boy, that's impossible. Fresh yeast shelf life. That is so hard to say that.
The shelf life of fresh yeast.
Fresh yeast shelf life.
Fresh yeast
Fresh
shelf.
yeast.
Oh Lord, no. Fresh
It's
yeast
impossible.
shelf life. No, that's why you got to do it the other way around. You got to say the shelf life of
the shelf
fresh
life of
yeast.
fresh yeast. And so fresh yeast was basically a block of yeast that was used again in that sort of century between the discovery of how to isolate yeast and make it possible to use, and then the discovery, and it's actually still used in some bakeries today. But the problem with fresh yeast is that it's perishable. It often needs to be refrigerated, kept cold, and if it wasn't used quickly enough, the yeast would die and your bake wouldn't rise.
So that's what you're saying is it'd be used in like bakeries because only bakeries are going through that much yeast so quickly, right?
I think so. And I'm sure there were the occasional dedicated home cook who was using it, especially because there weren't a lot of other options. So I think that was just what people did.
Then what came next?
So what came next was this active dry yeast. And so we actually have the term, so we both know the term proving dough. We use it all the time. That term actually comes from the need to prove if a yeast is active.
What?
So you see this happening in Nancy's and Richard's yeast loving cakes. Did you see how they both made a sponge?
Yes. Explain that. What is that?
So a sponge is a mixture usually of warm milk, the yeast, and then traditionally also some sugar and a little bit of flour. You're basically creating this beautiful, lovely soup for the yeast to munch on.
A utopia for yeast.
Exactly. And so we all know what happens when the yeast eats. It creates gas.
Okay.
So think of when you just dump a packet of active dry yeast into some milk or water. You know how you normally let it sit?
Yeah, you're supposed to like put it as a thin layer and just let it sit for 5 minutes, right?
Exactly. And so you can see it foam, and that foam is proof. I'm saying this because that's where I get the word from. It's proof that the yeast is active and can be used in a bake. So that's where we get the term proving from, is from these sponges that were used to test to see if the yeast that was previously fresh yeast, and we had to test that probably more often to make sure that it hadn't, gone bad. But even now, so I'm taking this quarantine opportunity to be with my family right now. And so I'm in my parents' kitchen, which has been very fun. But I was looking in my mom's cupboard trying to make my Kugelhopf, and I found some yeast that expired in 2017.
Oh, Jesus.
Which shows how little my mom bakes. So there's still a need, even now, depending on when your yeasts expire, to test and prove that it is active. And that's where we get that term from. That's still sort of that period of letting the batter rise is known as proving.
So that was started with fresh yeast and then became, what was it, active dry yeast?
Active dry yeast, yep. And that's pretty much what we use today. There's a couple other forms. I'm not super popular here in the United States. But that's...
Did you look up what the difference between active dry yeast and instant yeast is? Instant yeast?
Yeah, instant yeast is just a cursed word.
Too many S's.
It's so true. Instant yeast is just a faster active dry yeast. It came later than active dry.
Is it because of the way it's made, or is it a different strand, or?
No, I think it's just the way that it's processed. It could be that there's they've crammed somehow more microorganisms in there. I'm not sure. I didn't look too far into what differentiates the different sort of methods of delivery for the same species, but that's the gist of it. I'm really glad that I finally decided that this was the time to really look into leaveners, because like I said, everything from now, every bake that we deal with, pretty much nobody besides when we're doing biscuits, everything else has some sort of air in it. We're not just eating dry hunks of flavorless flour. They're all leavened with something. And so I really wanted to establish what the different types were, understanding when they were all sort of used. And now when we go forward, we'll understand, I think, and know a little more about the foundation of how each bakes were made.
And so kind of the idea of when you have a biscuit, it's really crisp. There's no leavening in it at all. When you have a cookie, you often will see baking soda or something in the cookie, which is probably that same idea that you want the cookie to have a little bit of height to it. You don't want it to be thin and crisp. You want it to be kind of almost cakier. So yeah. I'm sure that leavening is what that is for, is to make it less and more.
Exactly. If you wanted to do an experiment, you could make a cookie with no baking soda or baking powder and without whipping any or creaming any of the sugar in the eggs, because even the creaming process introduces some air into the eggs and the sugar mixture. So try that, make a cookie without it, and guarantee you it will not be as tasty. Really just, it gives that sort of creamy, gooey, melty middle because it has somewhere to go.
Speaking of cake, a Princess Torte. No, sorry.
Princess Torte. Princess Torte.
There's an A. Maybe? I don't know. Princess Tart. A princess cake. Let's call it a princess cake.
It's a princess cake. It's a Swedish princess cake, and our poor bakers had 2.25 hours to finish it. Which, when you look at the number of layers in that thing, including the fact that they had to make their own marzipan topping, cream, custard, jam, and then the sponges. And weren't there 2 different types of sponges as well?
No, so some of them had to make sponges again and again, but supposedly it was a Genoese sponge cut into 3.
Okay, it was one. Okay, cut into 3.
Then you would also make whipped cream and then a creme anglaise, a patisserie cream. Yep, creme pat, and you'd mix half into one, and then you'd use half of another, and like, I think it was like was this one that was like 23 ingredients and like 2 hours to use them?
Yes, which is my nightmare. Even though it looked so pretty when it came out. And I have to say my favorite part of this whole thing was obviously Chetna struggled a little bit at the beginning and had to rebake her cake. Her face when she gets finished on time, and this is the first time I'm doing this, but I'm dropping the time. If you go to minute 27, second 33, so 27:33 in the episode, you get to see Chetna's just look of victory as she's able to finish this bake on time. And then she gets second place, which is amazing. And that just was like probably the best moment of the whole episode for me.
I'm so glad you brought up Chetna's face because it is my favorite part of this episode. She is so pumped. She raises her hands in the air like she's just on a victory lap. I was so proud of her. But that is a woozy of a technical. Obviously, I don't think I've ever heard of them. Have you ever heard of them?
I had never heard of them. I immediately wanted to bake one after this, but it's something that I really want to eat so bad, and I would bake if I had like 2 other people in the kitchen helping me with that one thing.
Or especially if you had like 6 other people who wanted to have it with you, because like to make this for yourself is insanity.
No, absolutely not gonna happen.
I'm gonna bring up my favorite internet chef actually. Or one of. Can you guess who I'm going to mention right now?
If it's not Claire Saffitz, I'll have to stop working with you on this podcast.
I've mentioned this person like 3 other times in the podcast.
Really?
She's not my favorite.
I feel like
She's
I know.
Just something I keep bringing it up.
You're going to say. I can't remember her name, but you're going to say it, and I'm going to go, oh.
Yep. Anne Reardon.
Oh, yeah. She does the after show. She does the extra slice.
No.
Nope. I don't know what you're doing.
Anne Reardon does a YouTube channel called How to Cook That. She is a professional chef. And she talks about like, she has a lot of videos.
You mentioned her name before. I just had never had the context to store that information away with.
Oh, no, I'll need to send you videos. Okay, cool. So she recently did a video because we're all in quarantine, even in Australia. And she did a video of like either low flour cakes to make or no flour cakes to make during quarantine.
Been there.
And funnily enough, one of the cakes she suggested doing is a princess cake. And the way she did it, she kind of, I wouldn't want to say cheated because I love what she does. But what she did is she made a dome of cake to put on top and then filled that with cream as opposed to trying to get a perfectly rounded dome of cream.
Oh, that's clever.
So she like did this wonky creation of cutting out a parchment paper to give you the appropriate shape. And it was very, very cool. But she gave you like a cheat version of a princess cake and it looked perfect. If it weren't for the marzipan, which has nuts in it, I would be all over this cake. Right there with a Victoria sponge. I'm surprised I haven't made this before because it's just like cream and custard and cake and a little bit of strawberry jam. Like it sounds like spectacular.
Yeah, I think it's something that maybe when we're back together in the same room as one another, this can be our sort of celebratory bake together. Listeners will let you know if this takes place.
So now, my favorite time for tea. Because I get to give you some weird quiz or whatever.
I dread and love them equally.
And out of tea, I finished my tea early on. You're not drinking tea.
I'm having a beer, listeners. I'm slowly working on it.
Okay, I finished my very small cup of tea and I regret that I don't have anything else to drink. My Diet Coke's across the room. I can't get it right now. But time for tea is a great time to give a little shout out to friends and fans who have been making desserts or have been sending in photos. We haven't got a whole lot of people using the hashtag HopPod yet, but I'm sure time will get there. I did, however, find while scrolling Instagram, her name is Carly Fleischer. Her Instagram handle is Outside the Tent, and she, during quarantine, has made a phenomenal amount of the bakes that they do in the tent, and they all look spectacular. I would give her a follow because she is so cool, and all of her bakes are beautiful.
They're gorgeous.
She did make her own princess tart, and she made her own marzipan, which blew my mind. I almost didn't really know you could make marzipan.
I think I knew you could when you were talking about that like old school cookbook that you had found from the library, I had one that I think I had gotten thrifted to me that was like all of these really random, very like adult complicated bakes that I was definitely too young for, but I remember marzipan being in there and really wanting to try it and never getting around to it. So I don't think it's too hard. I think it's just something that we associate with buying from a store.
Yeah, something like it's way too much work to ever do like phyllo pastry. Like, why would you ever make that?
Right, when you can just buy it. We'll get there. Wait until one of us has to make phyllo, then we'll.
Oh, God.
It's coming.
Hopefully we'll be together and we can do it together as opposed to trying to do it by yourself.
Yeah, that's a challenge I want a buddy for. I'm a little nervous.
And so if you end up baking anything, let us know. You can send us a message. You can tag us. You can use the hashtag HotpoPod, whatever you want. Let us know you're baking things because we want to see them. My little time for tea quiz section here is something that I thought was totally true and evidently is not. Is there a difference between caramel and caramel?
I always assumed it was just a pronunciation. And I have to say I'm a heathen. I say caramel.
Ooh, wow. Okay.
I blame my Midwest roots.
I mean, maybe it's a thing in the Midwest, but I did do a little bit of research into this, and the internet is furious. Oh, my Lord. They have some very strong opinions about caramel. And so in that, it is caramel, not, or actually, I heard it's like there's a whole other way to pronounce it that I think.
Caramel, not caramel.
I think they say it's caramel and not caramel, and I'm like, that's not okay. But evidently, the proper word is caramel. Carmel is a city in California.
Okay, listen, it's also a pronunciation of the word. If you're from the Midwest, I have to defend myself a little bit here. The general Midwest, and maybe especially Michigan, accent is to just say words as fast as you can. Like, we don't pronounce the T's in the middle of words. They become does. Like, everything is about like how quickly you can say and communicate your message. So the extra A in caramel is just a waste of time and space. You can say caramel. People know what you're talking about.
I'm not saying that this is what I believe in. I'm just saying the internet believes that caramel is the sugar treat and that Carmel is a mountain in Israel or the city in California.
Internet, I'm ready. You can come after me anytime. I'll be right here.
So this is the thing I thought was crazy, was in my head for years, caramel was like a chewy or a solid filling, something that was really tough, or like one of the candies you get those awful plastic wrappers. Like,
yeah,
that's
I hate those.
Caramel to me. Whereas caramel is like the runny sauce, or you bite into a chocolate, you get like a big long pull of caramel. For some reason, my brain was like, those are two different variations of the same thing. And so for years, I went around thinking that. And it wasn't until the trolls of the internet told me I was wrong that I questioned everything. And so I think in the past 3 weeks, I started saying caramel, like exclusively. But if you say caramel, I know what you mean. Do not worry, you are valid.
Thank you. I've tried saying it both ways. But I think if I'm being truly honest with myself, it's just caramel. I'm gonna do some caramel work. I'm gonna make caramel spirals.
Live your truth. Live your truth.
Well, that brings us really so perfectly into, thank you, Nick, the showstopper, which was the Dobos Torte, which is basically, I mean, they designed it in this challenge to be a little bit different than the original. I actually did some research into what the sort of original, traditional version of a Dobos Torte is. And it's layers of fatless sponge baked individually, much like pretty much all of our bakers did, that are then layered with a traditional chocolate frosting or buttercream in the middle. And then the top layer is covered by a hard layer of caramel. And then it was sort of covered, the sides were covered with chopped nuts. And the idea was that it was to prolong the shelf life of this cake, which I thought was really cool. I was just trying to get some sort of idea for how to incorporate the spirit of this bake into maybe what my flavor combinations could be. And instead I learned this cool fun fact that sort of explains why caramel is such a big part of it. But I think in the tent, Paul and Mary really blew up the whole caramel thing. I don't know if that's maybe a more modern take on it or if they just wanted to test an excuse to test the baker's sugar proficiency. I don't know.
I think it just worked well because the idea of a Dobos Torte that I found was what you said, like a vanilla sponge and usually I found like a chocolate, like almost a Swiss meringue buttercream, or maybe just a variation of a Hungarian buttercream. I don't know. But it was always vanilla cake, chocolate frosting. And I think because the traditional has those wedges of caramel on top, it's why they're like, let's just figure out what they can do with caramel because it didn't fit into any of the other categories.
Yeah. So the wedges are actually came later. First, it was just a layer on top to prevent moisture loss.
So yeah,
Isn't
that's
that
the
cool?
one I saw was that like, so the recipe I even saw was you would take one of the layers, cover it in caramel, and chop it up then. And so you'd get like these perfect triangles of a layer of cake and caramel. But you're saying it was like a cake, like a full
You
topper
did
of
that
caramel.
same thing, but instead of fully chopping that layer up, you would just leave that top layer.
Oh,
And that way, that sort of
fascinating.
sheet of caramel on top would keep it from losing too much moisture.
So I made this.
I cannot believe. I'm so proud.
My friends and my family were very excited. They thought that the cake looked and tasted beautiful. I literally had a friend say, "This has 7 layers!" Just really excitedly because
That's so cute.
he hadn't realized.
And I'm really excited about your flavor combination. What inspired you? This is so cool to me.
So my brain went to, okay, this showstopper is all about caramel. What goes with caramel? And there's a lot of flavor combos that are very generic that my brain went to first, just chocolate and vanilla and those kinds of things. And so for some reason my brain went to, okay, what about like, what do I eat caramel in more often than not? It's candy bars. So like the Milky Ways of the world or the Twix bars. Like what kind of combinations could I think of that were more interesting than just chocolate? And so there is a bar, hashtag not sponsored, that Reese's produces called a Take 5 bar. And so I was going for that combination of flavors. So a Take 5 bar has chocolate, peanut butter, peanuts, pretzel, and caramel. So there's 5 different flavors and textures there. And so I went for that as best as I could. The final cake turned out to be, after Malory and I went through various drafts of this cake.
Yeah, iterations
And,
of
failures and
blueprints.
successes, and there were pictures and drawings all over my notebook. The final one was a chocolate cake, which was 7 layers of chocolate cake, a chunky peanut butter mousse, so it's just basically peanut butter mixed with whipped cream, and that was in between every layer. And then between each cake layer was also a drizzling of salted caramel sauce. I made a whipped chocolate ganache. I topped it with pretzels, caramel sauce, and caramel shards. So I made almost like a candy glass, but instead of using white sugar, I used golden sugar to make it look like caramel. And if I had like an hour or two more, I would have used spun sugar, but I just could
You had
not.
already made 7 layers.
I was like a 3-day process of like baking and chilling, and it was just a whole thing. And I was gonna make a Swiss chocolate meringue buttercream, but it went so wrong. So I just ditched that, and I was like, nope, screw it, I can't do this.
No.
So
What do
after
you think
that,
happened to it?
so I had been told on the interwebs, that I could make the chocolate Swiss meringue buttercream ahead of time and then just use it when I needed it. And that did not work at all. I tried it, I think 1 or 2 times, and it just like didn't work right.
Was it
And then-
cold too much? Could you warm it?
So I think what happened is,
I'm curious.
so when I was mixing it, I whipped it, and it looked good, but it wasn't growing. It's supposed to like triple in size, and it didn't quite do that. So I kept on whipping it. Then I over whipped it, and then it kind of curdled. And so I looked up how to fix that, and evidently it was too cold. So I warmed up the microwave and added it back in, and that like brought it back to life. And so that's
Interesting.
evidently one of the solutions. Like, I'll have to master Swiss meringue buttercream some other time. It was just a weird mess, but it like looked perfect. And so I finished it. It was like midnight. I just threw it in the fridge, and then 3 days later I came back to it and tried to whip it back up again to make it into a frosting. But unfortunately, it was so grainy and hard, it just wasn't spreadable. So I just chucked it. I was like, I can't do this. I'm not going to try. And just made chocolate ganache and used that instead, which worked perfectly. It was so beautiful. It had like that rustic approach. We just kind of swirling into the chocolate.
Yes,
And
love it.
between the peanut butter mousse, I thought was so cool, and the pretzels to give it a good crunch. It was just like a nice, interesting combination of flavors. I would never normally put peanut butter into a dessert, but it worked so well.
Really?
Yes. So I have a thing. I don't like peanut butter on my desserts. I don't like peanut butter on my ice cream. I don't want them touching it. I don't want peanut butter.
Interesting.
The only peanut butter I want in my dessert is a peanut butter and Oreo, which if you've never had, go do it. It's fucking amazing. I'm going to use the F-bomb because it's that good.
It's that good. It's worthy of it. All right, I'll have to go try one.
So you did, I mean, this is a whole thing of I had to make these tiny thin layers that cooked for like 7 minutes, and I had to put like the tiniest amount of cake batter and spread it out in these pans. And I only had 2 cake pans, so I had to do it like 4 or 5 times into the oven. It was a whole thing, but it worked surprisingly well. So I really can't complain. If you were to try this, what would you do, Malory?
So I struggled with this a little bit, and I think I went in kind of an opposite direction that you did. And that's because caramel's just so sweet. Like it's just sugar. That's all it is. And it's kind of one note to me and a little bit overwhelming. So I love the idea of thinking, oh, where do I normally have that? Candy bars. I think that's genius. My train of thought was, okay, what will go with this that will match it and go well, but then also cut it a little bit. And so I came up with chocolate bourbon pecan, hoping that bourbon or rye would sort of cut that sweetness.
Yes.
And so doing bourbon caramel buttercream frosting for in between the layers, covering in some sort of chocolate ganache or something like that. And then for sugar work, I think it would stick. Now that I know about the tradition, I think it would be really cool to stick to that sort of traditional hard caramel glaze on top. And then doing sort of caramel drip pecans, a lot like Kate did, but instead of having them sticking out, I think it'd be cool to like do a crown around the top layer and then just do blitzed caramelized pecans on the side. I think that's where I landed on this.
That sounds pretty spectacular. If I were to do the caramel again, there is a company in Boston that makes volcanic salt caramels.
Ooh.
So it's like this black salt mixed in with a caramel, and it's so good.
Yeah, I feel like I definitely do like a salted caramel, maybe with a bourbon caramel buttercream, but it just needs salty. It needs a little bit of that like something to
That's
cut
why
it.
the peanut butter and the pretzel thing just worked shockingly well. Because it brings down that like, it's just caramel and caramel and caramel and caramel.
Yeah.
It was so good. So I really hope that it doesn't become a regular in the rotation because that was a lot of work.
It's so true. And it's funny, I feel like a lot of the bakers struggled almost as much as you did. Like, and if we think about our favorite and some of our top bakers, people who struggled most with this were Richard had a hard time. Kate wasn't doing too great. My favorite part though, like Louis obviously did a great job as always. I think it very much fit his sort of very organized way that he works. And my favorite part of the show, and they've done this a few episodes now, is they're showing like the last minute panic and everybody's like trying to get the last decorations on. And you can see everybody rushing around. And then they sort of pan over and Louis just like wiping down his bench. His bake's already at the end of the table. It's like my favorite bit. He's just like, got it, done. I love it.
He didn't do super well, but again, one of our favorites did very well this week.
Yeah, Chetna got Star Baker. I was so excited. She had really earned it. I feel like, especially again, like I said, my favorite part of this episode was her face when she managed to complete the Princess Torte on time after having to rebake her sponge. And she's been one of my favorites from day one. I love her flavor combination. She's another one that's been pretty much constantly inspiring me. So I'm glad that she got to earn Star Baker during this show. It's amazing.
And this is one of my big issues with this episode was that they made such a big fuss about, Paul and Mary were so angry at one another. They were just squabbling back and forth, which throughout the series doesn't happen very often. Or at least later on in the series, they make it like a bigger and bigger deal that they had such a terrible time figuring out who was going to go home. But they went over the top with this episode just to say, it's nobody, lads. No one's going home.
Yeah, I think they really wanted to make a big deal out of it because it's unprecedented in a certain way, and it might feel kind of cheap to people who had already been sent home. So I definitely understand, and I think it's one of the challenges that comes with having only 2 judges. There's no tiebreaker there. There was no third judge to say, you know what, sorry, Mary, but I disagree with you. So I think that's just sort of the nature of it. And I kind of appreciate that they took the advantage of having already had 2 people go home the week before and allowed them both to stay, because I think they knew that both of them were really good bakers and had a lot of potential and still do. They're still like amazing bakers, obviously. So I actually really was glad that
Well, I'm so
nobody
glad
left.
that no one left. I think they amped up
Oh, for sure.
the drama of it all in this episode. I was so glad no one went home. And so we don't really have hats off this week, which we talked a lot this week, so that's totally fine. So hats off
Hats
to all
off.
the bakers.
To all the bakers, and hats off to Mary and Paul for letting us keep our two favorite bakers, Kate and Richard.
I mean, at this point, I think all the bakers are my favorite bakers, so this is
It's so
problematic.
true. I love them all.
But even though I've watched this series so many times, I forget who leaves when. Like, I know who's going to be in the final, but I'm still just like, oh, no, wait. You can't leave? No.
I know. Ugh, it's an emotional roller coaster still after all this time. Well, thank you so much for listening. That brings us to the end of our episode today. I hope you enjoyed it, and you better believe next week is pastry week. It's my second favorite week after bread week, so I'm pretty psyched if you can't tell.
I'm dreading every second of it.
I'm not. I think you're going to do great, Nick. I believe in you. If you have enjoyed what you heard today, please tell your friends and family, check us out on social media, or subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. Every subscription and download helps us out tons.
We would love it so much if you would tweet about us and share how much you liked our show. You can find us on Twitter or on Instagram at HotBopod, as well as on Facebook at facebook.com/HotBopod. That is HOTBOPOD. You can find links to all of our social media, and you can sign up to be notified whenever we release an episode on our website, hotbopod.com. One last time, that's HOTBOPOD.com. or hatsofftobake-off.com.
My recipe for rosewater and almond Kugelhopf is on our website. You can access it by navigating to episodes and then find the post for this episode to try it out for yourself. If you do make it, definitely let us know. I really enjoyed it. It's a perfect tea cake. Have it with your sort of coffee and fruit brunch in the morning. I think you'll really enjoy it.
Actually, I think I did a lot of recipe tweaking this week, so I might actually be able to just share my Dobos recipe as well.
Oh, exciting. So we'll have both of our recipes up there. That'll be wonderful.
Nice. I'd also like to give hats off to Peter Lalish, who wrote our intro and outro music. You can find Peter on Fiverr as PW Lalish, as well as on Bandcamp under the name AKLF. As Paul says, interesting. Week 6, winging it. On your marks.
Get set.
Bake.
I'm just talking to Nick about what I like to bake. I'm just talking to Nick. I made a Kugelhopf.